Milton is the fifth hurricane to hit the U.S. this year, and that means many Americans are losing their homes. Now, flood insurance is supposed to help out, but it is becoming harder and harder to find. Regulators can't force private insurers to offer coverage, and companies can leave the state entirely if they're losing money. Florida insurers have declared bankruptcy or otherwise failed since 2003. Now, homeowners and businesses in flood-prone areas often turn to the National Flood Insurance Program. It insures 4.7 million properties nationwide.
Now, much of the structure of federal insurance protections is based on the assumption that the government's maps of which regions are most at risk are accurate. But FEMA's flood maps have not been updated for decades, according to the Hill's reporting. So where does that leave the millions of homeowners in Milton's wake?
I mean, look, I'm going to have a take here that is kind of controversial, and maybe people watching won't even like it, but if no insurance program is willing to offer you insurance for your home, on some level that's the market sending a signal that owning a home there is too risky and you shouldn't do it. I mean, I would not think that the government compelling insurance companies to provide you insurance to live there would be subsidizing risk that we're all now paying for. We, the citizens who pay our tax dollars, are paying for you to take that risk. I mean, think of like, you know, the government subsidizing risky like deep water drilling, right? If they're going to pay for it, that's incentivizing risky behavior. If you can't do that on the market because your liabilities are too great, that's the market sending a signal, don't do that.
Right, but then what happens to people who don't have the money to move house? I mean, then they're just messed up in a pretty big way because there isn't any insurance available to them. It's fine to say, yes, well, that is the market sending a signal. I don't disagree that it is, but if you have a house that you've lived in for 20 or 30 years is now more susceptible to these disasters and you don't have the financial wherewithal to go anywhere, then what do you do? I don't know.
Yeah, I guess I kind of fall in the middle on this one because I understand both arguments. It's obviously tragic when people feel like they need to either sell their house or they can't get insurance. And you see a lot of people stay in their homes even when they're in these evacuation zones because they sort of have this belief that if they're there, maybe something bad won't happen. I don't really understand that logic, but I also understand not wanting to abandon your home, your property, if you're not able to pack up and take it all with you. But at the same time, we wouldn't really make the same argument if someone built their house on the side of a cliff, right? We would say that that's a risk that you accept. It's reasonable that an insurance company wouldn't want to insure your home. So yeah, I'm kind of stuck in the middle here.
I mean, I have no love for insurance companies.
Right.
I think they're often very scammy, and you know, we all have to have car insurance, and if you live in an apartment, you have to have renter's insurance. Car insurance is, in my view, like notoriously scammy, where they go out of their way to find excuses not to cover, and you got to read the fine print and go, oh wait, I do have to pay this time. Why do we even have this? And you're required to have it under the law. You know, or it comes into medical insurance. Obviously, it was a big part of the Obamacare stuff that we all have to be covered because no one wants to live in a world where if you don't have insurance and you're in a car accident, the ambulance is going to decide not to take you. We don't really accept that, but you know, we want to make these things more cost efficient for taxpayers. You want to align, you know, market incentives with risk to discourage risk, and have it, you know, be in such a way that we're not all that then there's these emergency situations that the public has to pay for. And on some level, that is what's occurring with these hurricanes or extreme weather. Is they're taking on the risk, the people who live there, and we're all going to end up paying for it.
And a number of private insurance companies in Florida have gone bankrupt because of previous natural disasters that they've had to foot the bill for. So then the question becomes, is it appropriate for the government to step in with some sort of government-issued insurance or to underwrite those things? I would argue that there are cases in which it is, and I think that's where we probably differ. But I do think that it is a complicated situation because you don't actually want to incentivize people to live in places that their houses are going to be regularly destroyed.
I mean, I definitely think if the government says we're going to insure you, we're going to give you so much money protection in the event of a catastrophic weather event, if you live there, and like that's the deal, then they should follow. I don't think they should renege on that promise to people if you decide to live there under that basis. I'm not saying yank the rug out from anybody. It just seems like we should maybe, structure this differently moving forward, as climate change or changing weather patterns make it less practical to live on the coast and more practical to live on the vast and empty interior of the country where you can actually find very affordable housing.
Yeah, I guess my only thing with the insurance companies in their decision to pull out of Florida, statewide in a lot of cases, is that there is some conflicting science on whether or not storms are actually consistently getting more extreme. If you look at some of the climate models, they've gotten slightly more extreme, but then the amount of damage and deaths has gone down significantly as we have been able to sort of shore up our infrastructure to prepare for these disasters. So on some level, I wonder if they aren't sort of just making an excuse because they know that Florida is going to be a more expensive place to insure, just because it has more hurricanes than the rest of the country in general, not necessarily because they're getting more frequent or more extreme because of climate change. I mean, there was
a peninsula dangling in the ocean. I don't know why they designed Florida like that.
I mean, like there was a 1937 flood of Paducah, Kentucky that nobody could have anticipated, and if that happened today, we'd be like, oh my God, it's because of climate change that this happened. So that's a little interesting. I think a lot of people also, when talking about this, forget that flood insurance is usually an add-on to a home insurance policy. So pretty much anywhere you buy a house, it's not automatically included. You have to basically request it, and then the rate would differ, of course, based on where you live. So a lot of people don't have flood insurance just because it's not included in their typical home policy. And a lot of people make the perhaps false assumption that because they don't live in an area or that because it's not automatically included, that must mean they don't need it.
The house I lived in growing up in suburban Detroit, Michigan, had some kind of foundation problem, and when we had an epic storm like, I don't know, 10 years ago or something, the basement totally flooded, wrecked all the walls. My parents had to put in tons and tons and tons of money to dig under the house and install these like pillars to like lift the house out of the ground. You couldn't open the front door anymore because it was hitting the ground. It was crazy, and they had to put in tons of money to do that. And it's not something you would have anticipated necessarily. That's just the risk you take if you don't have an insurance program.
And a lot of these insurance policies don't cover natural disasters, right? Like the flooding is usually related to like a burst pipe or something related to the home.
Well, and that's what does annoy me, because that ends up being a little bit scammy, that you never read the fine print, you're like, oh wait, it's not, well then what am I paying for if it's not, doesn't cover this, not likely, but more likely than any other, what, somebody has to come with buckets of water and dump them into my basement for it to be covered by insurance?
Yeah, I wonder though, in the case of Florida specifically, like, I get the point that you don't want to incentivize the equivalent of someone building their house on the cliff edge, right? I totally get that. But does Florida have an interest in people not being so hit or affected financially by these kind of things that they actually leave the state completely? Is there a legitimate interest of the state there in trying to create some sort of level of basic security so that in a situation like you were describing, although from a natural disaster, if your parents had not had the means to do those repairs, they would presumably have had to move. And that seems just not a very wise course.
I think that's a very compelling argument for the people of Florida specifically. I think it's maybe harder to make that argument that the entire country should have to provide some subsidy for people to live in Florida. But other people in Florida, I get that argument. Much more coming up on Rising today. Stay tuned.